In today's presentation, we shall be discussing on blown up lizards that are meant to be dinosaurs, a lost scene with a Brontosaurus, how King Kong got involved, and a G-rated family film got too cheeky for its own good, starring my personal favourite cave girl. No offence Raquel Welsh. If cheesy dino flicks and lost deleted scenes sounds like your cup of tea, then don't forget to subscribe so you won't be missing out. Okay, with the context out of the way, let's discuss when dinosaurs ruled cinema. In 1940s America would see a uniquely different movie be released, titled 1 Million BC, which would capture a childhood imagination, combining fact and fantasy of humans coexisting with dinosaurs. The characters of the piece speak with no English and no discernible language. The story is purely told through a visual medium. This movie was under the wing of Hal Roach and co-directed the film with his son. The main hero, first starring role for Victor Mature, finds himself at odds trying to unite the Shell Tribe's peaceful ways with his family of origin, the Rock Tribe. His father, played by the legendary Lon Chaney Jr., chief of the tribe, is very uncertain upon the union. The son's accompanying lover, played by Carol Landis, which this flick being her first big starring role as well, daughter of the chief of the Shell Tribe, are seemingly at impossible odds. Lon Chaney Jr., just off from his big break from Mice and Men, had ambitions to follow within his father's footsteps. Lon Chaney, renowned actor and makeup artist for doing his own appliances. Chaney Jr. had already conducted his own makeup for his caveman character, but because of union rules, he was unable to do his own makeup. While King Kong had came out 7 years prior, the knowledge and expertise of the stop motion, the same method that brought Kong and many of the residents of Skull Island to life, was rather hard to come by, so the filmmakers needed to think of a new technique to bring the dinosaurs to life. The solution? Guys in rubber suits, the first dinosaur movie to use this method, and animals with extensive prosthetics to make them seem otherworldly and prehistoric. In fact, unlike King Kong, this film earned an Oscar nomination for Best Visual Effects. Later on, Hal Roach would allow people to purchase the footage of the dinosaurs, including several extracts that never made it into the final print. These stock clips were used in numerous of other pictures. Unfortunately though, the film's legacy has been drastically overshadowed upon the lack of confirmation as to how the animals were treated, as it doesn't take an expert to guess that many of the animals were clearly uncomfortable. Okay, so its legacy hasn't aged most gracefully, but 20 years later, it would aid as a foundation for two of Britain's most popular dinosaur movies. To understand our prehistoric story, we need to travel back in time to 1960s England. Hammer was a British film studio founded back in the 30s, but by the 50s to the 60s, Hammer had been steadily remaking the classic horror monsters, which some of their remakes spawned into their own franchises, and had successfully prospered overseas in the States. With their output now at the same capacity as the Hollywood studios, and approaching their 100th feature, Hammer had desired to do something special for the occasion.
Good evening. Do you know any good monsters? Well, Hammer Films are looking for one.
They had their goal set at doing their own version of King Kong, acquiring on Jim Danforth and David Elam to create a stop-motion test piece with King Kong on top of the Empire State Building. The test was eventually used as a Volkswagen commercial.
It has some advanced things most cars don't have, and a big trunk up front.
But by the time that Hammer approached RKO, the Kong rights were already occupied by Toho, and RKO had no desire to remake Kong to begin with. They would try once again during the 1970s, but with no prevail, so any prospect of a serious collaboration was virtually out of the question. But still wanting their big blockbuster, they instead bought the rights to remake 1 Million Years BC. With the plot featuring long-extinct animals, famous stop-motion animator Ray Harryhausen was assigned on board to bring the dinosaurs to life. Inspired as a young lad by seeing the original King Kong flick, Harryhausen's first subject within the medium of animation was with dinosaurs, and would widely become known in his twilight years as the Dinosaur Man, but in his professional career, he only worked on 3 films with the terrible lizards. Those 3 occasions was the 1956 documentary Animal World, where the first 10 minutes is an animated prologue about prehistoric life. The sequence was a collaboration with Ray's mentor, Willis O'Brien. Sadly, this would be the last time both men would get to work with one another, as O'Brien would pass away a number of years later. In the years that followed, Harryhausen would shop around a dinosaur script idea from O'Brien, which would feature cowboys entering into a long-forgotten valley, where they discover some... well, I think you've already guessed the plot by now. This concept finally became the 1969 film Valley of Gwangi. Upon original release, his most successful dinosaur film by far was 1966's 1 Million Years BC. Harryhausen was a talented filmmaker, single-handedly doing the animation by himself, but he wasn't independent sculpting the animals. The craftsmanship was done by Arthur Hayward, who additionally worked at the taxidermy and modelling department of the Natural History Museum in London. At the time, he went uncredited for his work on the movie. During pre-production, he was in a little bit of hot water with Harryhausen, as when he was presented in Animal magazine, the photograph they use in the background, you can just make out some unfinished dinosaur models from 1 million years BC. Ray, being the secretive man, wasn't entirely thrilled of the designs being leaked out in this fashion, but there was no permanent damage, as both of them would later reunite to work on the Valley of Gwangi. While not this woolly mammoth being sculpted, there were discussions to feature the hairy elephant in the film, but the idea was dropped pretty early on. Being an epic fantasy piece, 1 million years BC wasn't concerned about the truth of science, such as dinosaurs and humans coexisting. The remake was still updated for the taste of viewers at the time, with that distinct flavour of Hammer, such as their version of Dracula was a blatant sexual predator, and Dr. Frankenstein killed with no mercy in the name of science. In this Hammer incarnation, the glamorous and well-shaved male Hollywood hero are instead washed out to be grungy, greasy, and, well, quite hairy. The ladies are fortunate enough to retain their glamour, but of course have very distinctive clothing, and most of the characters has a selfishness to them. In a time with primitive humans, only a few of them have the concept of compassion, all of them living not in a lush, beautiful Adam and Eve jungle, instead in a virtually close to extinct environment. Barring a few set pieces filmed in London, Hammer utilising their inflated budget, the majority of it was filmed on location in the Canary Islands. And of course, as previously stated, the dinosaurs being brought to life by the more charmful Harryhausen animation, although some of the other primeval creatures were just regular animals, enlarged to seem fearsome. This was a deliberate choice by Harryhausen, as he felt peppering in the real animals before the stop-motion creatures would help to build up to the audience that the visual effect animals were indeed real. Ray's theory would eventually come to fruition, as at the time the public was speculating if the turtle was indeed a real animal. Unlike its 1940s counterpart, it doesn't feature as many creature scenes, but it's generally the one out of the two that's more highly appraised for its effects. Coming out at the peak of Hammer's popularity, the film matched just as fairly as that status, with an $8 million return from its $500,000 budget, and it would further rise in a pop culture status, not due in part of the expensive stop-motion dinosaurs, but more due to its, sex symbol. The famous Raquel Welch image on the poster became culturally iconic in its own right. Amongst the fans of the film, there was another promotional piece that earned just as much interest.
This is a Brontosaurus from 1 million BC. Unfortunately, he played a very minor part. He was scheduled to play a much larger part.
A photograph depicting the confrontation between the humans and the Brontosaurus that was never seen in the final print, although the Brontosaurus does make a small cameo at the beginning of the movie, being the first stop-motion dinosaur we get to see, and would have returned back for the finale of the picture. Going off an interview by the late John Richardson in the Cinema Retro magazine, issue 46, he was inquired about the sequence. There's one scene I wanted to ask you about that's fascinated fans for years. The still from the film shows you battling a huge Brontosaurus, but that scene was never in the final cut. Did you film the scene? Yes, I'm sure we filmed that. Obviously, the dinosaur was added later, but I remember acting out on what's on those stills at that location, although obviously it was a long time ago. The implications as to why it was cut out was because this was Hammer's first feature film with a heavy use of special effects, dealing with the tedious process of stop motion, and wanted to see the movie being done far quicker, rather than waiting months on end to see the results, feeling that there was already enough creature scenes in the movie. So by cutting out this fight sequence, they had saved several months worth of labouring work. For Harryhausen, it was a bit more of a tense experience, with the studio overlooking his shoulder to get a lot of the effects work done, as a lot of the scenes with the animals aren't as technically as complex as his prior works. At least within the term of execution, this would be the film that Ray would look upon the least fondly over the years. The behind the scenes may have been a little bit unfortunate, but there was still an open door of communication between both parties. While Ray did decline to work on the special effects for When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, there was another movie idea in the pipeline, with Hammer potentially backing it, titled When the Earth Cracked Open, which after an earthquake would have seen prehistoric monsters emerge from the ground. Although this movie idea never came to fruition, the 1970s would be a dire time for Hammer. Their lucrative market for horror films was just decreasing in popularity, and their US market had completely dissolved off. Officially, the company would become liquidated by the mid-80s, which by consequence they could no longer afford to keep up their film library, so that too went under, meaning that such assets like the original negatives to their motion pictures were just simply junked. A negative is the highest quality form you can get for a physical film, so the prints that have survived into the 21st century exists in inferior quality, making the prospect of a serious HD to 4K restoration somewhat difficult. Made for the movie's 50th anniversary, there was a Blu-ray release to complement the occasion. The high definition on the disc was a fair restoration effort, given the provided sources. The surviving storyboard of the scrap Brontosaurus sequence has been made available via this release, giving us our only look of what the original finale could have been. With the success of 1 million years BC, Hammer had aspirations of doing a follow-up. They really wanted Raquel Welch to come back, but she wasn't very keen in reprising in that fur bikini. But one big thing did come back from the original, and sadly, that was Hammer's lack of poor understanding on how to deal with the special effects, much to the annoyance of the stop-motion animators. Only just 2 years later, beginning production in 1968, was When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. The prior film launched Raquel Welch into stardom. The Hammer producers were keen to bring her back. They tried but failed, although they were able to find another starlet, a brunette actress, Victoria Vetri, who was under a multi-picture contract with Warner Bros. And 7 Art Films, the other studios collaborating on the semi-spiritual sequel. Vetri agreed to the starring role, but refused to dye her hair. Thus the filmmakers had to compensate with a blonde wig. Just like its prior film, 1 million years BC, the characters speak in an untranslated language.
Akita! 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 Yokita? Akita! Yokita! Akita! Akita! Akita!
The made-up dialect that's used consists of only several words. There's an alternative take in the trailer where Sana utters a few more lines of dialogue, where in the final cut, the extra lines are just trimmed down, seemingly to simplify the language even more. The reins for managing the stop motion was handed over to Jim Danforth, hired on after the script was already finalised, and precisely what would be filmed on location and studio was already locked down and booked, without concerning Jim on the feasibility on how achievable many of the special effects were. The script by the end of the movie was meant to see many prehistoric animals emerging and running away from the tidal wave. What was worded was just simply inachievable at the time, so instead only several crabs are present at the end. A lengthily planned scene that never got animated was at the point in the film where Tara and Sana were being chased by the rock tribe, but with both groups coming across giant ants, which savagely devours the hunting party. Tara, then being chased by the ants, opens up a small sulfur volcano which bleeds down and completely incinerates the entire ant colony. Life-size models of the ants were created, were brought on location to the Canary Islands, and had subtle mechanical features to make the models partially animated. The smaller stop-motion models, their bodies were made out of a tea-infused saucepan. But of course, given how elaborate this sequence would have been, it was the first out of many sequences to have its filming cancelled. Rumour has it that the ant models were going to be recycled for The Legend of King Kong, which Jim was involved with before the remake was cancelled. The baby dinos alongside the mother introduced midway through the movie, an insistent inclusion on Hammer's end to add some humanity and a comedic flair for the audience to enjoy. Although this family of dinos were meant to be reintroduced near to the climax of the movie, rampaging and aiding with Sana. While it was fully storyboarded, it never got photographed or filmed, so poor old Sana had to face it alone. On rescuing Tana, to patch up many of these cuts, they resorted to using stock footage from the 1960 version of The Lost World. Despite these deleted portions being made for reason of cost, there were still many shots, such as the egg nest scene filmed in London studios, wound up being more costly than they would have been if they were filmed on location. This was because they needed to use matte paintings to expand the studio sets, which takes time and money to fully render, versus to the location, as you've already got that fully set environment to photograph. The unneeded cost could have been prevented early on if Jim Danforth had a say upon what would be filmed on location and studio. The producers just didn't have an inside knowledge of where to prioritise the money for a special effects film. Jim Danforth, anticipating that the most famous of all the dinos, Tyrannosaurus Rex, or at least a similar looking meat eater in appearance, which would be clearly called for. So to prep up, he got an early head start in creating a predatory dinosaur puppet. Presenting his work in progress model to the producer, Mrs. Young, she despised the model in her own words. "Such dinosaurs represents puffs, male homosexuals." Ugh. So it was by Hammer's homophobia that the film was deprived of a flesh-eating dinosaur, which is a little strange. I thought Hammer was pro-gay. I mean, why else is the male loincloth seen in the movie is shorter than the female's ones? Famously, there is a small bit of test footage used in multiple retro dinosaur documentaries, which sees the Triceratops of the film fighting against a flesh-eating dinosaur. These short clips were animated by Roger Dickens, who had a hand animating the Triceratops sequence in the movie. The flesh-eating dinosaur, termed Allosaurus, seen in that clip, is actually his model from one of his prior but cancelled projects. The Allosaurus was only implemented for the purpose of the test and was not intended to be used in the final movie. The final prehistoric creatures presented in the film are not part of the dinosaur family tree. Rather, some of the animals lived during the dinosaur period or were partially inspired by fictional extinct animals. For a movie that's titled When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, only the Triceratops / Styracosaurus is a true dinosaur that appears in the movie. Despite the turbulent production for the animators, the film still got nominated at the 44th Academy Awards for Best Visual Effects, but lost to Disney's Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Uniquely, just like a classic Disney film, the movie was rated G upon its release. Although when one sits down to assess the motion picture, you may find the likes of violent moments that aren't traditionally shared within your typical family flick. But there are two distinctive scenes that you wouldn't see any Disney princess getting wrapped up in, where scene number 1, brunette cave girl Ayak is forced upon. Then scene number 2, our two main stars, Sarah and Tana, are alone and can finally embrace one another, which eventually leads to to them having a small swim. Both scenes in question features the ladies topless. Even at the time, the film couldn't go on by without an ounce of complaints from parents that weren't too pleased watching these scenes with their kids. The following decades, upon TV airings and home media releases, those small bits were just trimmed out, just to help retain that G rating, despite the film still featuring many gruesome bits of the dinosaurs. Although when the film was released at Best Buy as a double feature alongside Moon 02 back in 2008, they accidentally used the print that contained the nudity for the DVD, so it was very quickly retracted, and for about a decade it was a highly sought after collector's item. That would all change in 2017. The film's release on Blu-ray, fully remastered as originally released, and yep, that includes the original topless scenes, and it's still rated G. Hammer did want to continue on with the Dinosaur series, but by the 70s they were just having money issues, and since they were just so darn expensive, these flicks, it just wasn't meant to be. Still though, we're left with two uniquely different dinosaur movies from the genre that can be universally enjoyed by kids and adults. Adults though, I imagine for different reasons. As the old saying goes, one for the dads. And I guess if we're being diverse here, one for the mums as well. Oh, sorry about that. Cheers for watching. See you next time.